All right, wonderful. Welcome everyone at home and here at the KWI Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Essen. My name is Stefan Höhner. I'm a cultural and social historian here at wonderful KWI, and I'm also one of the investigators of a new international research project we're very excited about called Cultures of the Cryosphere, which is funded by the European Research Council for the next 6 years. And I'm happy to do this research as part of a fantastic team that includes Alexander Friedrich from TU Darmstadt, Susanna Alpanzer from Uni Paderborn, Bronwyn Parry from the Australian National University, but we also work with Chris Biemann and his team from the Hub of Computing at Uni Hamburg, and also Boris Michel from Geography, University of Halle. We are currently holding our kickoff meeting, project meeting, and it's very exciting for us to, like a lot of them, I meet it the first time. We are discussing currently our ambitions for the project, and we are celebrating the project start and the kickoff tonight with you all. It's a wonderful thing, and we do so by having our first so-called cryo lectures by Bronwyn Parry. I want to just briefly introduce Bron to you. She can tell you more about our theme, our research, and also her adventures in cryo in the last decades. Then we're happy to have a Q&A and a discussion, and eventually we would love to move or carry everyone over to the other room to continue the discussion over a glass of whatever you like, and to celebrate with us our upcoming adventures in artificial cold. Briefly, some words about Professor Bronwyn Parry. She's a social geographer and medical anthropologist. For us in the project, she's really a remarkable scholar whose work has been instrumental in developing research on the application of cryotechnologies in biomedicine. And she was one of the very first researchers to investigate this topic through detailed empirical and conceptual analysis. However, before she became a founding person in the field of cryogenic culture, Bron actually had a different career. She was the first female carpenter in the Australian film industry, working on 2 Mad Max movies, among others. For unclear reasons, she really left this respectable profession to move to a much more dubious business, anthropology. And she began her professional academic career at the University of Cambridge, working on the commodification of bioinformation that resulted in her PhD and a book called Trading the Genome, Investigating the Commodification of Bioinformation. Her second book, Mind Over Matter, explores memories, dementia, and brain donation together with visual artists that we will hear more about, I think. And their third book from 2015 focuses on the global circulation of body parts, medical tourists, and professionals. And the book is called Bodies Across Borders. In 2016, Bron established the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at the King's College London together with Nicholas Rose. In 2017, she also found time to publish her latest book, Bioinformation, a seminal work that establishes the role of cryogenics in creating artificial, semi-artificial DNA and tissue samples. She then served as vice president and vice principal of the King's College until mid-2022, when she was appointed as dean of the Australian National University's College of Art and Social Sciences. Tonight, Bron will speak to us in a lecture about 45 minutes. The lecture has the title Cultures of the Cryosphere, Charting Emergent Geographies and Historiographies of Our Relations with Cold. Happy you're here, Bron. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here tonight. And to launch this project, so particularly to be here in Essen, to which I've never been before, and to KVI, which is just a wonderful opportunity for me, and what a wonderful place for you to be, where you just get to do research all the time, which I'm so envious of. But hopefully I'm going to do more of it myself before too much longer. Okay, so I'll start by saying, respected colleagues, friends, and fellow travellers, shall we say, it's a particular pleasure for me to return to Germany in 2025 to launch a project that had its genesis nearly 10 years ago now in lovely Darmstadt. It was at that time that Alex Friedrich kindly invited me to talk about work that I had undertaken some 10 years before that, work that was at the time, which is important for you young researchers, so seemingly arcane and esoteric that I barely imagined that anyone would have any sustained interest in it, let alone be wanting to work on reviving it. And that work was on the centrality and importance of techniques of cooling and freezing to the constitution of life. When I first started working on freezing and cooling, people were like, what? You know, what are you working on that for? That's so weird and odd, you know, but it just goes to show some investments pay off in the long run. Of when and how interest in such techniques began to emerge, of what such technologies make possible in terms of the suspension, expansion, and extension of human life, and the question of the planetary implications of their continued adoption and what that might be for us. So it's clear now that this latter question proved to be quite a prescient one. For over those years since these technologies were first introduced, the world has become ever more reliant on processes of cooling and on the technologies of artificial cold. Indeed, there is barely a single aspect of contemporary life that is not now wholly dependent on such technologies. So here's an example of some of them. Space cooling has become more and more ubiquitous. The refrigeration and transportation of food along globally extensive cold chain networks has become so normative that we barely notice that our vegetables now come from Kenya, and we accept without question that most of the biomedicine that we rely on now itself relies on cooling. And we're coming to understand that artificial intelligence, I've mucked it up now, sorry. My apologies. I'll give it back to you. Sorry. That artificial intelligence also remains something that, much like its human creators, functions better when it's not overheated. Even so, it must be said that general awareness of cooling technologies and infrastructure remain, I would say, that's fine, remarkably low. So such things are both everywhere and yet seemingly nowhere. When I tell people about this new project, they often look confused and say things like, "What do you mean by cooling?" I explain all forms of refrigeration, cryogenic freezing, space cooling, artificially cooled environments, biomedical storage banks, and the like. "Oh yes, of course," they say, "I see." But when I tell them this next singular fact, that these cooling technologies are together the greatest driver of global warming, they are truly astonished and can barely believe it. And that is because the history of our relationship to cooling remains fragmentary and obscure. We have as yet no unified account of this phenomenon. But how should we begin to tell the story of this collective, slowly emergent love affair with cooling? Should we start at the beginning or perhaps at the end? Because although we're not quite yet at the end of that story, we are now gradually becoming aware of what our embrace of such technologies will likely mean. For what began as a love affair has quietly morphed into something that might more accurately be described, following Lady Gaga, as a toxic romance. So in a world of rapid and sustained warming, it's our reliance on artificial cold that increasingly makes life on Earth tenable. However, as we can also see, it's also becoming apparent that this very dependency on cooling could, if we're not very careful, drive us to the brink of extinction. For as global warming increases, so too does demand for artificial cooling. Projections indicate that a 5-fold increase in energy is required to service global cooling by 2050, and you can see it charting off the map there. So meeting this vast energy demand with existing resources is neither feasible nor sustainable. Moreover, artificial cooling systems contribute considerably to CO2 emissions, further aggravating global warming and leading to even higher cooling demands. And this creates a vicious cycle of continually rising but uneven consumption of cold that threatens to stoke social conflicts and drive ecological crises. So how can it be that something with the capacity to fatally destabilise our fragile global environment has emerged without ever really impinging on human consciousness in any significant way? It must be said that in all of the technological realm, cooling occupies a very curious place. Most of the technologies that have dramatically reorganised human life, from printing presses to automobiles, computers to nuclear power, have been the subject of sustained social attention, including at times very public processes of valorisation and disapprobation. But the same, I would say, cannot be said of cooling. Cooling has crept very stealthily into our social practices, such that it has become, certainly since the mid-20th century, one of the most pervasive of all modern technologies, one that transforms our relationship to the lived environment in fundamental and quite profound ways, and yet its ingress has proceeded in largely unresearched and undocumented ways also. So the premise for this project, therefore, is that before we arrive at an existential moment in which we cool ourselves to death, we had better come to understand in much more granular detail than we do now our shared and complex relationship with artificial cold. It's a good thing that I'm at the latter end of my career, as I don't think I would otherwise have found the reckless courage to begin charting the geographies and historiographies of such an expansive and complex planetary scale phenomenon. I do so only as I have the enormous privilege of working with such an exceptional group of esteemed young collaborators who will, in the annals of history, be rightly identified, I am sure, as amongst the most important proponents of research in this important new field, and I mean that sincerely. Together, we posit that without a thorough understanding of A, how global infrastructures of artificial cold have emerged, and B, of how we might differentially adopt cooling technologies and why we do that, we will find it difficult, if not impossible, to change our behaviours in relation to artificial cold, and particularly to learn to use it in sustainable ways. So, to begin that process of reimagining our relationship with cold, it's crucial, we believe, to start with an in-depth examination of the cultural dynamics that drive our unsustainable reliance on artificial cooling. And this is because, prima facie, the answer to our unsustainable use of cold is already evident. Just say, turn the air conditioning off or set it a few degrees higher. So if we just did that, perhaps we could all go home without the 10 million euros or the 6 years, it would seem. But just as the answer to global warming is already equally evident, just stop burning fossil fuels, and yet we fail to do that also. And we suggest, therefore, that we need to expressly investigate why and how we use cold, how cold-producing and cold-consuming cultures emerge, their spatial and temporal configurations, the desires, the norms, the practices that drive and sustain their development. If we can establish why and how we engage with cooling, what it gives us and what it makes possible, we might also discover how to better rationalise its use and foster a more sustainable future for artificial cold. So clearly I don't have the time here to explicate all that will involve, either substantively or methodologically, although all that will soon be explicated via our online platform. What I thought I might concentrate on here tonight is the genesis of conceptualisations of the phenomenon of artificial cold in Western scientific thought, and of how these have progressively shaped so much of our contemporary cultural relationship to cooling and freezing, to explore, in other words, the genesis of these now highly ubiquitous cryogenic cultures. So our project seeks to map out the emergence of cryogenic cultures across 4 key empirical object fields. So food, biomedicine, including assisted reproduction, space cooling, and data storage. So my intention is to begin by unpacking not only something of the origin stories of cryo practices in each of these domains, but also the impulses and the motivations that have led to the adoption of cold in each. And here I highlight both the technologies, but perhaps more importantly, the imaginaries of cryotech. The extraordinary ways in which they've transformed our conceptions of the very nature of human and animal life, its existence, temporalities, and metaphysical boundaries, but also to think about the costs that accompany the realisation of these newfound desires to live beyond the normal parameters of natural existence. As Thomas Lemke and his colleagues have noted, cryotech has ushered in new ontopolitical regimes in which life itself is able to exist in a state of suspension. By arresting processes of decay and dying, cryo enables what Radin suggests is a kind of life beyond life. Living matter is, as I have also argued, rendered in forms that enable it to exist in a curious interstitial zone, neither fully vitally alive nor fully inertly dead. So my own interest in humans' capability to suspend life through the use of artificial cold began with some work undertaken by the American geographer Cindy Katz. She suggested to me that the exploration and indeed exploitation of nature has been shaped by 2 distinct forces: expansion and involution, and therefore by both extensive and intensive models of investigation and inquiry. So, for example, expeditions and voyages of discovery out there into the world on the one hand, and laboratory-based investigations into the inner workings of organisms acquired out there in the field on the other. So some of the first forays into the involuted depths of nature were undertaken by the natural scientist Robert Hooke in the early 17th century. Hooke was transfixed by the possibilities presented by the scientific method and its attendant technologies, particularly of the fundamental constitution of nature, that's what he was interested in, that had until that time stood out with both observation and conception. So you couldn't understand what this thing was because you couldn't see it or look into it. This was to change with the invention of new technologies in the mid-17th century. In undertaking his early studies, Hooke noted that although, and I quote, "we have not yet overcome one world, yet there are so many others to be discovered. Every conceivable improvement of telescopes and microscopes now produces new worlds and terra incognitas to our view." It was in his field-defining work Micrographia, that was published in 1665, that Hooke first unveiled to public view the first magnifications and representations of everyday entities, from things like fungus to coal, cloth, and the cells, for example, in cork, and in fact it was Hooke who defined the word cells. Amongst these were the first depictions of ice crystals, extracted as they were, using this extraordinarily fine and beautiful microscopic technology, but they were extracted from observations, I love this, of his own frozen urine. So why go somewhere else when the material is right there to hand? So the structure of these crystals, this is where he speaks about them here, really beautiful, if you want to read it. The structure of these crystals was that's so familiar to us now, but was remarkable to him. Indeed, as he noted, the exactness and curiosity of the figuration of these branches was in every particular so transcendent that I judge it almost impossible for human art to imitate. Ironically, it was to be the very structure of these ice crystals, which seemed at the time so beautiful, but largely inconsequential, that was later to shape so much of cryogenics in tissue preservation in animal, plant, and human domains. As my colleagues Alex Friedrich and Stefan Honner have noted, one of the most significant achievements of cooling and freezing technologies has been their ability to reorder and thus reconceptualise the conventional lineal temporal relations of life and death, to enable biological processes to slow down, to be suspended, to loop back on themselves, to restart in a series of bodily and temporal suspensions and prolongations. And one example of how this is realised is by slowing processes of bodily dissolution or decay. And certainly one of the primary preoccupations of the late medieval period was how to store perishable food and prevent its decay. Francis Bacon's experiments on arresting the despoilation of food through the application of cold was realised in his first attempts to stuff a chicken with snow on Highgate Hill in 1626. So as he said here, he jumped out of his coach, alighted, went into a poor woman's house and bought a hen and stuffed it with snow because he was interested to see how long it could conceivably last. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, for Bacon, those efforts resulted in his death, untimely death from pneumonia shortly thereafter. Very regrettable. But this experiment was merely a precursor to similar, more sophisticated efforts to condition bodies through the application of cold. This conditioning was also achieved in a variety of ways. Ice houses, such as these, the earliest of which date from northern Mesopotamia, at a period under Zimri-Lim, the king of Mari, when it was said that never before had any king built such a building. Archaeologists have since found in China remains of ice pits from the 7th century BC, but there's also written evidence that the Chinese used them even earlier than that. Alexander the Great built some in 300 BC, while it's known that Romans used them in the 3rd century AD. In all instances, I would say these were extraordinarily emblematic of a kind of sovereign power, but not of the power to make die, but rather of the power to let live. So they became a key material device for realising the ontological and political transition from the exercise of repressive legal sovereign power, most frequently demonstrated by making things die, to a new political order in which the state, but also private actors such as kings, benefactors, philanthropists and so on, came to discipline relations to the natural world, matters of life and death, birth and propagation, health and illness, through efforts that were directed towards the optimisation and the prolongation of life, not the cessation of life. Thus, processes of refrigerating food can be seen as an intervention that prolongs food's vitality and viability as a source of human sustenance, but also, following Foucault's later conceptions, one that constitutes an early instance, I would argue, of techniques of self-care. So in other words, an example of how people, especially those in the higher stratas of society, institute practices such as the ingestion of higher quality or singular foods that not only help sustain their own biophysical power, but which also generate compelling wider narratives about their ability to preserve and improve themselves through the adoption of these new habits and behaviours, which of course cost a considerable amount of money. This kind of narrativization continues today. If we look, for example, at the status grabs that come in the higher echelons of our society around the ability to ingest foods that are considered to be of high status or singular, so such as, for example, the consumption of prime beef now in China, and those whose consumption is only made possible through the generation and maintenance of extensive global cold chain networks. So in this case, that is also true. The desire for high status, de-seasonalised foods in localities that are significantly distanced from the food's point of production continues to be one of the key drivers of cold chain consumption around the world. So here, for example, is an article on the Chinese consumer preference of beef with geographical indications, so that which can be credentialised as coming reliably from somewhere else in the world, and that on the right is a chart of their monthly imports of frozen beef, as you can see, going from 2007 to 2019. So what then are some of these other practices that we think are really important? Well, three we think warrant particular attention. The use of cryo in biomedicine, in space cooling, and in data management. These began to emerge as important loci of investigation as long ago as the 1990s. At this time, my attention became strongly focused on what more advanced methods of cooling and freezing, in particular cryopreservation and vitrification, might make possible in the biotechnological realm, particularly through processes of capitalised value extraction. So what do I mean by that? Well, through the 1970s and 80s, a series of new biotechnologies were developing or reaching fruition. Things like tissue culturing, DNA and RNA sequencing, tomographic scanning and cloning, to name just a few. And what proved to be absolutely central to all of those were techniques of freezing and cryogenic storage. A profound transformation of biological materials and our relations to them occurred as a consequence of their development. So these technologies allowed, firstly, a particularly intimate kind of mining of nature to occur. With their introduction, it became possible, for example, to disaggregate the human body and human bodily materials to their finest constituent parts, to genes, to plasmids, etc., allowing each of those to become available, as the historian of science Paul Rabinow put it, as discrete, knowable and exploitable reservoirs of molecular and biochemical products and events. So cryotechnologies provide the means through which to produce these new artefactual renderings of the body. The word artefact derives from the Latin arte, by skill, and factum, a thing made, and refers to anything made by human skill. And rendering means to cause something to come into being in a new form, and that is precisely what these techniques achieved in relation to elements of the human body in the late 20th century. So the application of cryogenics and tissue culture enabled us to create an entirely new set of biological artefacts, extracted cells, gametes, tissues, cell lines, etc., that, as Hannah Landecker notes, enabled life to be extracted from the body, detached from its connection to the milieu interior, so that it could go on to not only survive temporally, but move, grow, and differentiate itself externally. So these new artefacts were distinguished from their historical counterparts, things like the anatomical specimen, or which was pickled normally, or botanical illustrations in some crucially important ways. So rather than being dead or inert, these cryogenically stored frozen materials, such as organs and tissues, retained their vital or generative qualities. This made them amenable to experimental manipulation rather than just observation, and thus available to be creatively reprocessed in economically productive ways. So each artefact becomes a valuable commodity in its own right, but also one capable of generating further products and hence further value. So the cell line, for example, becomes a germinal stock that can be altered and manipulated to create from it many others, each with their own applications and commercial values. So from these rather humble beginnings has arisen an almost existential ability to preserve and reanimate living tissues, organs, and biological products of many different kinds. And this in turn has given rise to a very specific and real technological infrastructure and network, one that now plays an absolutely central and critical role in all of contemporary biomedicine. It has given rise to the creation of enormous archival living tissue repositories and buildings, including, for example, they contain both some living and some reference collections, but the American Type Culture Collection and the Svalbard Seed Vault here. But it's interesting that talking about this, when you look online, this was actually in an advertisement. It said, cryopreservation of cell lines from a fringe science to advanced reality. So there is even a recognition within the industry of what has happened there. So these types of resources provide foundational resources, I would argue, for the re-engineering of life. Notably, in recent years, for example, the production and global distribution of COVID-19 and other vaccines. And through the latter, the Seed Vault, ironically enough, the prospective resuscitation of life forms that might be rendered extinct through oncoming processes of climate change and global warming, processes that these technologies themselves are actually acting to drive. Other banks include some of the world's largest gamete banks, and they provide resources for another of our rapidly burgeoning biomedical industries, assisted reproduction, which has also grown exponentially across the world since the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1987. Although it's become ever more ubiquitous, there is relatively little awareness that it is an industry that also relies entirely on cryogenics. Human fascination with what might be called reproduction at a distance began in the mid-18th century with Spallanzani's studies on the role of seminal fluid in conception, work that he began through experimentation with frogs. Building on Leeuwenhoek's prior discovery that seminal fluid contained what he termed spermatic worms, Spallanzani determined to, quote, follow this race of little animals to the end. In order to undertake his experiments, he first needed to collect some seminal fluid from frogs. Now that's a confounding experimental point, isn't it? How are you going to do that? No easy task, that's for sure. To collect these, he famously dressed many dozens of excited male frogs in tight, waxed taffeta breeches. So he made little trousers made out of waxed taffeta for these frogs, and he popped them in them and then excited them with the sight of other female frogs. I know you think I'm making this up, but I'm really not. So having secured the liquor from these excited frogs, Through these ingenious methods, he then performed a number of trials, proving its essential role in conception by demonstrating that only eggs that had been brought into direct contact with this seminal fluid brought forth young. So by intervening in the conception process, he touched the collected sperm onto the eggs. He discovered that he could produce what he described as artificial fecundation, succeeding, as he noted, as well as if the male had performed his proper function. So I think he was quite proud of himself for that. He later injected a spaniel bitch, a dog, with sperm derived from another dog of the same breed, and was astonished to discover that his intervention culminated 62 days later in the production of 3 lively puppies. But translating artificial insemination from the laboratory to commercial production was achieved and could only have been achieved through the introduction of new techniques of cooling, although these were not initially very high tech. So the first international transportation of sperm that I've been able to identify occurred in 1925 when rabbit semen was sent from Cambridge to Edinburgh in a cooled Dewar flask on an overnight train. I don't know how it would have done in Germany at the moment because I'm not hearing anything good about your train network. But anyway, it got there, and amazingly, it survived the night train to effect fertilisation of this rabbit in Edinburgh the following day. Now, I just ask you to pause for a moment. Imagine the astonishment that must have accompanied this experiment. Until that point in time, all reproduction required, even in Spallanzani's experiments, what I would call up-close and personal interactions. But this was no longer a social fact. On the contrary, it was possible to be able to conceive conception over an extremely large distance and over time. So what that meant was that reproduction could now become highly selective. So thousands of different samples of reproductive material, be they sperm or eggs, could in time become available to recipients all at once. So entirely new economies in gamete production and circulation began to emerge. So starting initially with cryogenically stored samples of bull semen, which were used to accelerate processes of animal husbandry in bioagricultural production, such techniques were shortly mapped over to the human domain through allied processes of cryo-assisted in vitro fertilisation. Such processes have gone on to create not only new globally extensive markets for sperm and eggs, but have also fundamentally transformed, I would say, social expectations about the desirability of certain kinds of progenitors. So human beings have come to now understand that when it comes to procreation, they are no longer restricted to individuals from their immediate locality who appear, on the face of it, to be of good stock. Rather, they've come to realise that with the aid of cryogenics, they can now draw on a worldwide list of donors, each of whom has been pre-tested for quality, in a kind of eugenicist fantasy that valorises, I would say, reproduction without risk. So this, for example, is the global carrier screening market. So you can have all sorts of donated gametes from banks screened with carrier screening for all sorts of conditions that you think that the donor might have, or that might be incompatible with your genetic material, and select someone that you think therefore is without any risk. So cryotechnologies have also induced newfound expectations that we should be able to prolong or even reanimate life through the storage, resuscitation and reutilisation of tissues and organs. The ambition of being able to freeze and revive whole mammals began with the work of the UK's preeminent cryobiologist at that time in the 1950s, Audrey Smith. She began her experiments at the UK's National Institute of Health Research in the 1950s. Having anaesthetised some golden hamsters until they ceased breathing, Smith then transferred them to melting ice baths containing 50% propylene and glycerol at 5 degrees C until the colonic temperatures of the animals reached between 0 and 5 degrees. So what that means is that they were maintained at that temperature for between 50 and 60 minutes until they were effectively frozen stiff. Despite the use of the cryoprotectant glycerol, subsequent dissection of these specimens revealed that resuscitation had been hampered by the presence of ice in the hamster's organs, including the brain. It was these ice crystals, the very ones that Hooke had first identified in his magnifications, that were rupturing these cell membranes, and this occurred during the thawing as well as the freezing process. The researchers realised that attempting to defrost the hamsters by a direct external heat source, the equivalent of, like, if you like, putting the hamster by the fire, would not work, that the internal organs of the hamster needed to be defrosted first and without direct heat source damage. They consequently set out developing a bespoke apparatus to rapidly thaw the frozen hamsters from the inside out. As James Lovelock, the inventor of this specialised diathermy and apparatus, noted, it worked with surprising efficiency. Hamsters that were frozen to -5 degrees C for 70 minutes were completely thawed in 3 minutes. Although the researchers at Mill Hill also reportedly employed Lovelock's device to cook their sausages at the annual summer barbecue, they were not quick to grasp the potential commercial applications of their invention, at least not until it was later marketed globally as the microwave. Here's the diathermy apparatus, there's the hamster, there's the description, and there's the microwave. So that's how the microwave was invented. Astonishingly, some of the hamsters were successfully resuscitated, and some that were frozen for relatively short periods went on to enjoy nearly normal lifespans. However, those that were frozen for more than an hour rarely recovered. Thus, researchers concluded that there was in fact little prospect of storing whole frozen animals in a state of suspended animation with the hope of later reviving them with their full function intact. Despite that fact, researchers are so often undeterred by fact. Research into cryopreservation of mammals and whole humans grew and came to inform a view amongst some that it might be possible to freeze and later resuscitate biologically dead humans. Robert Ettinger's thesis, first published in 1964 under the title The Prospect of Immortality, suggested that it might be scientifically possible to store people at very low temperatures until a time when medical science could resuscitate and then renovate them by repairing almost any damage, including freezing damage and senile debility or any other cause of death. This conception created the impetus for the growth of an entire immortalist and cryonics movement, as evidenced here in the frozen whole bodies of individuals who are now stored at the cryonics facility in the United States, or, and this is quite important, just their heads, that little one at the end is a head, detached in the hope that they might later be reattached to functioning bodies or even be allowed to exist, shall we say, in a world of their own. And this is proves to be, I think, quite important. So these questions of how severe freezing damage might be reversed, or even if it's possible to reverse it, whether functions such as memory might survive cryopreservation unimpaired, and indeed, therefore, where identity might reside in cases where the resuscitee emerges as a wholly engineered artefact, a kind of patchwork of graphs and implants and tiny motors, raised questions that proved to be central to theories of mind. They inspired J.D. Bernal, the famous Irish biophysicist of the 1930s, to imagine whether it might be possible to locate the brain in an entirely external location where it might be sustained in a nutrient-rich bath of cooled liquid, hooked up to a series of wires through which knowledge held in the brain might be distributed to others. After all, as he noted at the time, it's the brain that counts. That to have a brain, quote, suffused by fresh and correctly prescribed blood is to be alive and to think. And the concept of the brain in the vat was born. Now, such fantastical ideas as cryogenics and the brain in the vat may seem completely fanciful and largely irrelevant to our history of cooling practices. And yet, it seems to me that in this fusing of these outlandish imaginings, we begin to see the genesis of the idea of the data bank, an externalised, artificial brain that relies for its existence on an artificially cooled environment, an idea that has since not only become a possibility, but indeed a fully normalised reality. The idea that information and knowledge would exist in only one or more separate, singular, fleshy brains seems to be now, to us, perfectly antiquated. Over the past 40 years, we've become fully habituated to the idea of seeking and obtaining information, whether through smartphones or computers, from an externally located and networked brain. The servers, networks and data centres that allow such data and information to be circulated to millions of global consumers instantaneously via technologies such as these have now enabled what I might call, or what we might call, distributed cognition. Sounds brilliant, doesn't it? And it is, but again, the emergence of data centres that run all of our current and rapidly burgeoning AI, for example, has not come without associated social and environmental costs. So we all know this, but do we know this? So this is the total data centre electricity use from 2014 projected to 2028. So the idea that it might be possible in terms of space, the last of our areas of interest, that it might be possible for people to colonise environments that would otherwise prove inhospitable to human habitation, or to manipulate those environments to maximise human comfort within them, is another long-standing human ambition, one that many futurists have also sought to realise through technological interventions. So controllable environments, early iterations of which include both ice houses and glass houses, have become ubiquitous even without much public awareness. Space cooling, which has been made possible through the progressive introduction of mechanised air conditioning, has made temperature-controlled domestic and commercial environments an everyday phenomenon that we entirely take for granted now. We could say, to the extent that we have become largely oblivious to the ways in which we now use artificial cold to moderate our life worlds, and indeed have become inured to the politics that attend their distribution and use. For the adoption of artificial cold in this and other realms is, of course, a highly political affair. While five-star hotel rooms, conference centres and corporate offices are unhesitatingly cooled down to temperatures as low as actually a quite uncomfortable 16 degrees, we've all had that experience, I am sure, in other localities, individuals expire in temperatures that soar above 40 degrees or even 50 degrees C, relying on highly inefficient second-hand air conditioners to dribble out some cooler air, perhaps, or alternatively, to swelter in the hell that is brought about through an absence of any cooling in acts described by Nicole Starosielski as thermal violence. Or, as we know, the now dystopian reality of residents in Mumbai who live without aircon in their homes but survive extreme heat by sitting in their parked cars, engines running, aircon on. The concept of what we might call assistive living, of living in bubble worlds that are insulated from increasingly hostile external environments, is political when people have to live, in those kind of spaces. It's extremely concerning and should be concerning to us. But this concept of what we might call assistive living, of living in bubble worlds that are insulated from increasingly hostile environments and made amenable through mechanical conditioning, began with the Romans' development of rudimentary glass houses, but it found, I think, its quintessential expression in the American engineer and futurist Buckminster Fuller's 1959 ambition to place all of central New York City under a single 3-kilometre wide geodesic dome. You can read what he says about it here. One that could regulate temperature such that residents would, quote, no longer have to pay for heating or cooling in their apartments, as the entire dome would be kept at a comfortable temperature. Although, as Stefan reminded me the other day, it's interesting that the 3 kilometres included the wealthiest part of the Upper West Side of New York, mostly not anywhere else. He anticipated that the dome over Manhattan, as it was called, would reduce energy usage in New York City to 20% of what it was projected to be in 1960, the following year. Dismissed at the time and since as a fanciful folly, Fuller's seemingly eclectic vision of an insular life world has found a more contemporary echo in Dubai's prospective Mall of the World. The world's first temperature-controlled city in an 8 million square foot self-contained shopping and entertainment complex to include a Broadway-style theatre district, a pedestrian walkway, a 4.3-mile retail network of roads based on London's Oxford Street, what a confection this is, 20,000 hotel rooms, underground parking, an indoor family theme park, and a wellness district catering to medical tourists, all of which will sit under a retractable glass dome. And yet, what of all those whose lives must be lived beyond these hermetically sealed playgrounds, who must eke out an existence in the face of the existential threat of extreme heat without access to artificial cold? The extreme disparities that are emerging generate, without doubt, new forms of biopolitical discrimination that must be both identified and addressed. This kind of thermal violence operates through the placement of bodies in the thermal margins, as Joanna Radin and Emma Cavall described them. Quote, the zones of precarity, ambiguity, and unexpected generativity that also reorganise ideas about what it means to be and remain alive. While climate change will devastate environments, especially the environments of already marginalised people, it will also alter the thermal context of existing architecture and inhabitations, making some havens of redemption and others hellish sweatboxes. So, artificial cooling, as I hope I've shown tonight, fundamentally shapes and will continue to shape our life worlds. Since the onset of the Cold War, cooling and freezing technologies have become increasingly vital for a wide array of everyday practices, from nutrition to health and reproduction, dwelling, telecommunications, scientific research, and economic productivity. A global system of cold storages, cold chains, and air-conditioned spaces has become an energy-intensive, yet barely considered planetary infrastructure. This artificial cryosphere is all around us, and yet we have, as I suggested earlier, no unified account of its history, extent or function. And we know even less about the social desires, norms or values, in other words the cryogenic cultures, that drive the continually growing demand but unevenly distributed use of artificial cold. So, in the context of global warming, we know that artificial cooling is going to escalate significantly as countries around the world grapple with unprecedented temperature increases, and projections indicate a 5-fold increase in energy required for global cooling by 2050. Meeting this vast energy demand with existing resources won't be possible. Synergistics is the empirical study of systems in transformation, with an emphasis on whole system behaviours that cannot be predicted by the behaviour of any components in isolation. So it seems particularly appropriate, therefore, that Culture the Cryosphere, our new project, is an ERC synergy project. So we argue that without understanding how each element of this global infrastructure of artificial cold is intricately woven together, to create a set of now sedimented social and cultural and technical practices, we won't be able to comprehend our consumption of cold as a holistic phenomenon, nor avert the oncoming cold crunch. So by investigating their historical context and geographical varieties, Cult Cryo aims to identify also potential alternatives to our contemporary cold-producing and cold-consuming cultures. In order to analyse the constitution of cryogenic cultures, we undertake 4 interdisciplinary multi-sited case studies across those domains of food supply, air conditioning, biomedicine and computing, using innovative approaches, including mixed methods rooted in the history of technology, geography, digital history of concepts, ethnography and the philosophy and ethics of technology. So using a multi-layered open access geodatabase, we intend to map the expansion of the cryosphere, making visible the complex infrastructural cooling networks that currently encompass our planet. This first planetary atlas of artificial cold will illustrate its hubs, nodes, flows, uneven distribution and projected growth. Cooling also fundamentally shapes the temporality of life by deseasonalising food supplies and extending time horizons for biological reproduction, thus changing our concepts of freshness, of availability, health and life. Here we intend to employ cutting-edge big data text analysis tools like Scott and Diacolo to trace such cultural shifts and create a first digital history of these concepts. To reveal the cultural drivers for the adoption of cooling technologies, we will undertake ethnographic case studies in 4 key regions: Eastern Australia, Western India, Central Europe and the US American South. Immersive participant observation and qualitative interviews will reveal why cooling practices have accelerated and of how concepts that I've developed here tonight, such as assistive environments, distributed cognition and the prolongation of life, have shaped our embrace of cryotechnologies. So to reorient our relationship with cold, we must also understand the desires and norms that shape its use along with their consequential objects and practices. So a normative analysis that combines digital text mining with social research and philosophical inquiry will reconstruct how these values have evolved and why they vary through space and time. And finally, we hope to identify alternatives to the current overuse of artificial cold, and to do that we intend to gather abandoned, overlooked and innovative modes of cooling and incorporate these into an open access database, the Cryogenic Cultures Archive. Extracted focus groups and deliberative mapping exercises will also help us to test the reception of alternative approaches to mechanical cooling amongst particular groups. So to conclude, I'd say that artificial cold has fundamentally restructured planetary life at both a biological and a cultural level. However, the comprehensive dependence of modern life on a globalised cold infrastructure remains almost unnoticed, as well in not only in everyday life, but also in research and in politics. The far-reaching impacts of the cryogenic nature of our living contexts are still largely unexplored. So political and socio-ecological problems arising from the excessive energy consumption and carbon emissions of this infrastructure are also largely untheorised. So the reorientation we need must extend beyond mere technical tinkering with existing technologies, the turn the aircon up moment. It will necessitate a thoroughgoing examination of the prevailing socio-technical and cultural paradigms that guide our thinking and actions. So such a foundation is essential for initiating a comprehensive re-evaluation of our collective use of coal at an individual socio-ecological and political level. So undertaking a comprehensive analysis of these cultural dynamics that are driving our use of cooling, we hope that this pioneering synergy grant will provide the following things. The first geographical mapping of the cryosphere, an historical reconstruction of its emergence, an ethnographic account of its cultural constitution, and a philosophical and ethical analysis of its underlying concepts, norms and values, and lastly, an archive of resources to support collective reconsideration of cooling practices. But more than that, it will also provide, I hope, a first systematic conceptualisation of a key phenomenon of our time, a new field of knowledge, and we trust answers to an emergent global crisis, the unsustainable use of artificial coal. We invite you on this journey with us and hope that collaboratively we can together address this most pressing 21st century challenge. Thank you.